last of the set of sort of general concepts has to do with just sort of orientation and the idea of place. I've already gone over this a little bit, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly and try to get the rest of this panel done since I'm taking way too long on it. One of the really key ones, and this is still in common use today, this is common use in much of the Pacific, which makes sense when you think these are tropical or well, almost entirely with the exception of Hawaii, tropical environments. Visibility tends to be very short range, and you tend to be almost invariably on relatively small islands. So the actual land area is very limited. And so if you're going to orient yourself, north, south, east, west doesn't really make a lot of sense if you're on a circle. What makes a lot more sense is visibility. And visibility tends to be in two directions, looking towards the high ground and then looking towards the ocean or the low ground. So we take a quick pop here. Hang on a second. Okay. This is, I think I mentioned it before, this is in Google Earth. This is the old Hawai'i project. This is the Ahupua'a of Maui that we've basically put up with all the names too. The idea of Mauka Makai makes a lot of sense on an island. So if you're over here in Hana, looking Mauka means to look towards the high ground, which would be, the sort of eastern flank of Halakala. Looking Makai or Makai means towards the ocean. Just as a note, it's important to remember that in the Hawaiian concept, traditionally, ocean meant the dark ocean. The area inside of reefs was considered land. So, for example, Vaititi included the area to where the breaks are. All that from there, even if it was wet or dry, it was irrelevant. It was all land. When the water gets purple, sort of the Western concept, when the water gets deep on the other side of the reef, then you're in the ocean. So the idea of Makai meant towards the ocean, and then the Mauka or Mauka meant towards the high ground. And so this was a basic orientation system you find in most of the Pacific, which again makes sense given visibility, islands, etc. North, south, east, west doesn't really make a lot of sense, on an island like Maui, for example. What you then find is the major land unit. This goes back to the idea of ancestors and the fact that ancestors made things. Most of the Ahupua'a probably, in fact, I would be willing to bet they all did. We don't have all the names anymore, the stories attached to them. But Ahupua'a were generally seen to have been generated by things. So a particular Ahupua'a would be the residence, if you would, of an ancestor. So the ancestor, if you would, owned the property to a certain extent because the ancestor had made the property. And so the living folks that live in, for example, these Ahupua'a and Kihei, these Ahupua'a would be the basic land unit. And invariably, they're fascinating examples because the land units in Hawaii, this is typical in most of Polynesia, but especially here, land units were actually resource units. So there was sort of a standardized concept that if you had X amount of people, say hypothetically 500, the Ahupua'a would include all the resources they need from the Uka or Mauka section of the upper lands down to the watered sections of the lower lands for that group to survive. So if you would, every Ahupua'a like this one here, like this Keokea here, this would actually be considered an autonomous unit, and the people living in it lived here. So if you went back 300 years and asked folks where they lived, they wouldn't say Maui, they wouldn't say East Maui. They would say Keokea, or they'd say Waiahuli or Waiakoa. That would be the Ahupua'a they lived in. And that would be their sense of identity would be in that place. Now, one of the interesting aspects of this is, at least, even in the earlier, the remnant chants and stories we have, people very rarely ventured outside of their Ahupua'a. For example, my area of research is Kanaio Oahe. And these two Ahupua'a had populations in them. The population from Kanaio very rarely would walk down here. Now, you can walk, even if you walk on the shoreline trail, it would take probably 3 to 4, maybe 5 hours to get to Lualailua, just down the coast. But most folks would not make that. They might make that trip once or twice in their life, but they generally wouldn't. All the resources they need to survive on are found between the shore down here and this upper stretch that goes actually right to the western edge of the lip of Halakala. So for the folks living in Kanaio, this unit was their breadbasket. It was their food base. It was their residence base. And in many ways, it was tied to one or two ancestors. And outside of that was sort of like the big wide world. So again, if you want to think of it, it's another version of that inside outside. Kanaio, for the folks that resided there, was inside. crossing the whole boundaries, boundaries to somewhere else was outside. And so people didn't do it very often. And if they did, sometimes people remarked on it. So ironically, even though Hawaiians were very mobile in terms of their technology with canoes, etc., they weren't very mobile as a group. People did not spend a lot of time wandering around. They weren't interested in what's on the other side of the hill. Or if they were, they wasn't motivation enough to actually do it. And part of the reason for that, very simply, if you think back to clan, if this is a clump of 2 clans, maybe 3 clans here, another clump of 2 clans, 3 clans here, another clump of 2 or 3 clans here, where you go down to visit these folks, if your concept of people only includes the clan members like you, and these guys are another clan, maybe a clan that you're not particularly on good terms with, then you could actually be risking your life wandering down here. And there's a real famous story of Kamehameha getting trapped in this mess on the Big Island, ending up somewhere where he didn't have a relationship, didn't know where the folks were. They decided he was bad news and decided to whack him, and almost did so. So the idea that you have folks that you're tied to, and there's very strict etiquette rules there, but those etiquette rules end with the folks that you're tied to. Once you move outside of the Ahupua'a to other spaces with other types of clans in other places, those bets are off. So the side effect is that on one hand, Ahupua'a and the other terms, Ahupua'a in general will be part of a larger cluster. And again, I mentioned at the beginning of this section that Hawaii was not a unified system. And so what you find is, for example, this section of East Maui was oftentimes a separate moku. West and Central Maui, usually controlled through Lahaina, was almost invariably a separate moku. So these were actually separate autonomous states. They had high chiefs who ran them, and they're not beholden to anyone. If you were the high chief if you were the Ri'ai moku of West Maui for most of the last 600 or 700 years, you were the big boss. There was no one that you were under. So there wasn't a unified high chief of the Hawaiian Islands. Even Kamehameha, that's a little bit of a stretch because he never actually took Kauai and Niihau. So, Big Island was usually 2, maybe 3 or 4 in some cases, high chiefs. Oahu was usually 2. The chief in charge of basically what you might call the windward areas, and this section here, another high chief that was in charge of so what's now called Honolulu through Kapolei area. There was oftentimes a third high chief here, and this is where it gets really complicated because the high chief in charge of the Waianae region was oftentimes also responsible for this whole section of the eastern part of Kauai. I don't know how that happened or what the story is behind that. I've never been able to find any evidence of that. Having said that, the high chief for this west part of Maui usually almost always controlled Molokai and Lanai. So these 2 islands are actually almost invariably considered part of Maui for political purposes, though people are very aware they're actually physically separate pieces of real estate. Now, for our purposes, one of the side effects of this is when people had residences tend to be very conservative. Residences would be in a particular place and be in that place for a long time. More particular relevance to our class is the fact that if you're in a residence and everyone around you is relatives, kin, family, friends, and you've known each other your entire lives, just sort of say like the Williamsburg, but because you don't have the religious motivation to look good behind it, you're just relatives. You're going to find that, being interested in things like the size of your house, the quality of your clothes and such like that, really isn't going to have a lot of impact because you're not dealing with strangers. The superficial aspects of commodification aren't going to be particularly interesting if everyone already knows who you really are. Just because you're dressed in a nice outfit doesn't make you a better person if they already know you. So in this context, Hawaiian homes and Hawaiian residence systems tended to be very unimpressive by European standards when the Europeans show up in the 1770s. And here's an example. These are 2 Hale in Niihau. I think this is actually in the middle of the island. Remember right. And so here you see, this is in the 1870s, maybe 1880s, I would think. But anyways, the houses are traditional. And by Western standards, they're missing. They're missing windows. You think of your Calvinist home in Williamsburg, you're not going to be whitewashing these suckers. These are thatch. They're missing windows. They're missing a whole mess of stuff. And one of the problems is, Europeans see these and they call these homes primitive. What they don't really understand is the layout of house is entirely different. In all of Polynesia, in fact, when they were in Samoa, they're even more distressed because the Fale and and Samoa tend to be, almost open tents. And the reason for that was very simply one is the fact that you're in much more humid, warmer environments. So in Hawaii, for example, all you actually needed was a windbreak. Very rarely would it get cold enough to be an issue. Uh, so what you find in a traditional Hawaiian home is this particular area here that's under shelter is for storing things that you don't want to get wet, and it's for sleeping. So these are actually sleeping rooms. They're not houses in the Western sense. A huge part of what people did, they don't show it very clearly here, and I can't find one of my other images. What you have in here is a very large lanai up front. Lanai were actually usually beautifully made. So they're large, just like they are today. They're flat platforms. Very, very frequently in traditional Hawaii, right into the 1850s, they would be paved with ili ili, in other words, very small waterborne pavements, oftentimes in very pretty sort of patterns of colors. And so what you had is this is where actually people spend most of their time. If you came by one of these places during the daytime, the majority of things people would be doing would be either under trees if they need the shade, or they would be out here in the front of the house. And that's where people would eat, that's where people would socialize. To a certain extent, sort of like the Western, or I should say the American perception of a porch, which is why lanai and porch are usually sort of synonymous here. But lanai were actually in fact, frequently still today, are in much more common use more of the time than an American porch would be in a typical suburb. So the porch was actually most of what you would call actual living space, the sense of space that people interacted with, did stuff. So your combination of dining area, living area, and almost all that was here. When you went to sleep, you went inside. So, maybe in terms of actual use, maybe 60, 70% of your time spent in a Hawaiian home was spent on the front area, not inside the structure per se. So for our purposes, that means that if you looked at a Hawaiian home, they were really comparable to a Western home, even in the Williamsburg period or even much earlier. European homes going back thousands of years, where most of the residing was done inside. Here in Hawaii, and even more so in places like Samoa, a huge part of what people did was visible and in public. And again, that seems a little stressful, but you have to remember everyone around here, these two homes would invariably be owned by either brothers or sisters. They would be immediate close kin relatives. So you're not going to have strangers around. This isn't going to be something let out as an Airbnb, for example. So you're not going to have anyone you don't know around you. So, irregardless of whether you tried to do stuff in public or in private, people were going to know about it probably 10 seconds later, anyways. So the residence in the Hawaiian system was a hugely important part of this whole idea of community. Communitas or community was an enormous part of the Hawaiian social life, and it was invariably tied to the concept of ahupua'a in the larger sense. All these people were born, raised, and lived their lives next to each other. And if they went 2 or 3 ahupua'a away, that was in a land of strangers. So there wasn't really any way to compare it to the world we live in today. It was a very different world and a very different functional pattern.